In my previous video, I highlighted the work of Hans Rosling and his presentation of the best stats that you've ever seen. In this video, I want to continue that theme, but this time looking at a subsequent talk by Hans Rosling, also available online, called How Not to Be Ignorant About the World. And in that, he argues that we need to look at the data, we need to look at the statistics that are available in order to understand the world as it is, not as it had been previously. And again, I'm picking statistics from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, readily available data. And let me explain what you're going to be looking at. I've taken data for Ghana, but the data is available for any country you might be interested in, and drawn a graph of the enrollments, gross enrollments in lower secondary school for boys and girls, and for boys and girls from rural and urban areas. And the data is divided into quintiles. Now, I've chosen lower secondary because in Ghana in 2018, almost every child was in primary education, so it's not a very interesting story at primary level. Well, it's a success story. It says that the government of Ghana is now providing, in 2018, was providing primary school education for almost every child in the country. The story was, we'd expect the story to be different at upper secondary, which is more selective, then the enrollment rates are lower. But here's lower secondary school. We're looking at a period of schooling when we would expect every child to be in school, but where they're not all in school, and we're able to look at the differences between different groups. And in particular, we're looking at the poorest 20%, the richest 20%, and the quartiles in between. So we're seeing poorest over here, richest over here. And as you might expect, the poorest are least likely to be in school, and the richest are most likely to be in school. And somewhere in between there'll be some sort of move from one to the other. On the graph, I've plotted four lines. I've plotted males in urban areas, males in rural areas, females in urban areas, and females in rural areas. And so you've got 4 lines showing up on the graph. And here's the actual graph as I've drawn it from the data. And you can see actually the 4 lines very close to each other, overlap almost completely. What stands out is that the poorest quintile are the children who are least likely to be in school. And you'd have to say there's almost no difference between the males and the females. There's almost no difference between people in rural areas and urban areas. But if you were looking to see what the problem of school attendance was, you'd have to say it's poverty. It's not gender, it's not rural or urban, although at upper secondary, since many people have to move from rural areas to go to urban areas in order to go to upper secondary school, the picture is more complicated. But at lower secondary school, it's not about the difference between urban and rural areas. It's poverty, and in particular, the yellow line, which is the lowest line on this graph, is urban males. It's poverty among urban males that means that they don't get to school. So that's the current or the latest data on schooling in Ghana says actually gender is not the biggest problem, it's poverty. Now, that's not something that I'm saying alone. Hans Rosling has said this before. He said if you look at the enrolment figures, then girls are more likely to be in schools than you would expect. They're not quite equal in many places, they're very unequal in a few places, but in most of the world, girls are getting as good an education as the boys, or they're getting enrolled in schools. Now, what Hans Rosling says is just because they're getting enrolled doesn't mean that they are getting as good an education. Doesn't mean there's no discrimination. There are still barriers to girls that boys don't face. That's what Rosling says. I don't know how he knows. And this is where we ought to be thinking, if he's right, and if there is now still discrimination within the schools, it's not about enrolment anymore, it's about what happens within the schools. If there's still discrimination against girls in the schools, what kind of data would we like to have to look at that? Because I think that it's important to note that people collect the data for their purposes. This data, gender differentiated data, was collected from 40 years ago because at that point gender discrimination, gender differences were the biggest that you would want to address. That's no longer the case, so do we need new data to fit the new circumstances? And always can we think of some way of representing that what's going on in schools? Is there some data we already have around? We might look at, for example, differentiation in choice of subjects. Boys are being steered towards some subjects, girls are being steered towards the other subjects, so there are barriers within the schools. We might look at that data. We might look at other data that occurs to you or me, and can we find it? Is there something in the UNESCO database that tells us what's happening in the schools? Is there something in terms of student mobility, student background, that tells us that discrimination is happening somewhere else? That data may be available. There may be data which is a good proxy for that data, or we may need to start thinking about collecting a whole different category of data, because the data that has been collected to suit the theories and arguments of people who were setting up the data collection years ago. So we need to be thinking, could we find evidence? And I'm not sure what the evidence would be, but I am sure that the gender differences are not showing up. Country after country, the gender differences are not showing up in gross enrolments. So we need to move on from thinking automatically that boys and girls are being treated differently in this respect. They may be being treated differently in other respects, and we now need to think about what would we like to collect. And that data may be available on national databases. Ministries of Education may have more to say about this than the data that is collected in UNESCO. So what I'm doing here is echoing Rosling's suggestion. Not just that we should look at the data, that we should look at it carefully to make sure we're up to date, to make sure we are explaining the world as it is today, and that we're basing our discussion on the best available evidence. And if we don't have evidence, then we need to be clear about what evidence we would like. This is what De Bono talks about, being able to suspend judgment for a moment in order to think about what evidence would we like to have but we don't have at the moment. It's a very difficult way of thinking. It's one of the hardest ways in terms of De Bono's 6 ways of thinking, it's one of the hardest of the 6 ways of thinking, because people like to come to conclusions. And still, if I went to a conference today and made a presentation that didn't mention gender, I can be almost certain that one of the first questions that would come at the end of a presentation would be, have you considered gender differences? It's an automatic response. We're living in a world where the world 40 years ago is shaping much of the theory that we're looking at. We're looking at a world, I've suggested to you, it's clear from this graph for Ghana, and it's clear in many other countries, that the big problem is poverty. Those who want to hold on to the idea that gender is the defining problem of education will hold on to the idea that poverty and gender and class and rural and urban location are all interactive and you can't separate them out. And that's true to a point, but again, look at the graph from Ghana and note that it's the urban males who suffer particularly from poverty. There are interactions, there are correlations and interferences between these different categories, but it's not always the females who suffer from those interactions. We do need to look at the data in order to make sure that we're not explaining the world as it was 40 years ago. I do urge you to go and have a look at Hans Rosling, How Not to Be Ignorant About the World, because he argues in that video that the problem we've got with the world is not lack of information, it's not actually ignorance in that sense, it's prejudice, that we are prejudiced to see things, and we see in the news, we see in the newspapers, we see on social media particularly, certain things being picked out and highlighted, and if we're not careful, we will be focused on the disasters, on the wars, on the discrimination, on the failures, and of course those things are terrible. But the world is actually improving in many respects. It's improving in terms, as Rosling makes clear, in terms of the number of people suffering from natural disasters, in terms of the amount by which the education of girls differs from the education of boys, and in many areas we're seeing improvement. And when you're writing, if you're going to write, and you're going to study and you're going to do research that is relevant to today, you need to be sure that you're explaining the world as it is today and not as it was at some time in the past. So what I've done in these two videos is to draw your attention to the fact that Hans Rosling and his videos have been an inspiration to me. I hope they will be an inspiration to you. He wants us to look at the data, and I've shown you that since he presented that case that we should look at the data, the world has improved. It's made life much easier for researchers than it was. The software is better for doing graphical representations, and the data is available from many more organisations than it was in the past. There's plenty of data out there as background to studies, and we should be using it rather than simply dreaming up what we think the problems are in the world. And with that, I hope you will improve the basis of what it is that you are researching.